Love staying informed? Subscribe now and get unlimited access to local news, weather, and sports for just 99 cents a month for your first 3 months at inforum.news/join. Read every story, listen to every podcast, and download the apps that keep you informed and on the go 24 hours a day. So head to inforum.news/join right now to subscribe. What are you waiting for? Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month at inforum.news/join.
Welcome to Plain Talk. On this episode of the show, we're going to talk with our friend Matt Lewis, who makes occasional... I was looking down his list of accomplishments, where it's a frequent guest on Morning Joe, former CNN contributor. He's been on HBO Real Time with Bill Maher, CBS News Face the Nation, PBS Newswire, ABC's Nightline. Not once is listed the Plain Talk podcast in your bio, Matt. Oversight. Yeah, sure, that's what it was. Matt Lewis, he's great. He's a senior columnist at the Daily Beast. I follow his work. His previous book was Too Dumb to Fail: How the GOP Betrayed the Reagan Revolution to Win Elections. His new book, which I think is really interesting, because this is a topic, I think it's kind of a perennial thing where you see politicians and they get into office and somehow on a public, members of Congress, I don't want to say that they don't get paid a lot, because what they get paid for those of us who don't, they get paid a nice salary. They don't get paid a salary that should make them multi-millionaires necessarily. But a lot of them become that while in office. And I always think that's really interesting. The new book is Filthy Rich Politicians, Swamp Creatures, Latte Liberals, and Ruling Class Elites Cashing In on America. Matt, how you doing?
Hey, I'm doing great.
Of course, my co-host Chad Oban is joining as well.
Of course. I mean, I always appreciate when you introduce me before I ask my first question. That's not always the case.
That's not always the case. I do mess that up sometimes. That's how we didn't make Matt's list of places he appears, is because the host is not that good at things. Matt, I liked this book. And one of the interesting things is you seem to draw a distinction. This isn't like Eat the Rich type of thing. This isn't like we hate rich people. There's nothing wrong with being successful. And I think that's kind of a contradictory thing, in that a lot of times you look at somebody who's had a lot of success in the private sector, and we think, well, that commends them to elected office. They must know what they're doing. They've had this success. Maybe they would be good in office. But you're more saying, how are these people getting so rich once they reach public office? That's kind of your argument.
Right. The book looks at why the rich get elected and why the elected get rich. And I think the first part of that equation is interesting, and, I write about it. But the second part, I think, is more concerning, that once people get elected, they almost always get richer. And I think that is concerning. And I actually think it's contributing to the sense that the game is rigged. And we hear all this talk about draining the swamp. Some of that, I think, is kind of populist demagoguery, but some of it, frankly, I think is a legitimate response to watching elected officials use their position to cash in. Look no further than, as we're speaking, just yesterday, George Santos had this ethics report come out about, all the lies and unethical behavior he engaged in, and one of the reasons that he ran for office and that he did all this stuff was apparently that he wanted to personally enrich himself off of being an elected official. I think he also did it for fame and buzz and attention, but a part of it was he wanted to cash in, to use his position to cash in. Now, he actually got in trouble. He crossed too many lines the way he did it. But if he had just gotten elected and engaged in like insider trading, he would have probably been perfectly fine and fit right in with the other 535 members of Congress.
So, Matt, I will be honest. I listened to your book while flying to Atlanta, then to Washington, then home late last night, and I actually have like a full page of notes. So
Cool.
I actually listened and dove in pretty deep. And I will tell you, one of the things that I found intriguing about is being a North Dakotan. Our elected officials, particularly our governor running for president right now, are very, very wealthy. I would also suggest that Congressman Kelly Armstrong and Senator John Hoeven are two of the most accessible politicians. I don't put Kevin Cramer in that rich category. I think he's accessible as well. So sort of walk me through the thinking. I mean, you're not saying it's bad that these folks are rich. It certainly is an advantage. I mean, Doug Burgum would not still be in this presidential race if he didn't have $30 million of his own money to put in it, right? I mean, Pence and Scott are out of this race because they can't raise money.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So talk about sort of this rich isn't always bad, but it certainly is. If everybody has just a perspective of somebody who's rich, that doesn't create the best policy either.
Yeah, you're right. And like I said, I think the more concerning part of this book is that people who get elected get richer. But it's also worth noting that rich people have a much better time, a better chance of getting elected. And right now, the average member of Congress is about 12 times richer than the average American. And I think that gap has actually widened dramatically in my lifetime. And I think that's contributing to the sense that the game is rigged. Rich people want to get involved in politics for a bunch of different reasons. One reason I think, and some of them are very noble, by the way, I think there's this the transitive property of expertise, right? You think that because you could run the Bank of North Dakota, by God, you can straighten out Washington, D.C., right? Or because you started a software company that made a lot of money, you can roll up your sleeves and go to Washington and fix Washington the same way you fixed Fargo.
And those are not necessarily far-fetched either. I mean, it is. You look at, I consider that to be, for instance, Doug Burgum in a software company. I guess that's obviously a positive part of his resume. He was successful.
Yeah,
that's a good thing.
Absolutely. I think it cuts both ways, but it's not nefarious or pernicious or anything like that. It's reasonable. I also think politicians, sometimes rich people, get bored, and it's the same reason they buy baseball teams and rocket rides and submarine, trips to the Titanic, because they want something to do that's interesting and purposeful, and there's nothing wrong with that either. So in the book, I look at all their motives, and I think a lot of them are pretty positive, sometimes misguided, but mostly noble. I do think the problem, though, happens when you end up in a scenario where you essentially have to be rich in order to have a chance to get elected. And I think that's kind of where we are today. By and large, there are exceptions, but pretty much, even someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is considered to be this sort of rabble populist, is worth like $5 or $10 million, right? That's just the opening bid to get in the game, to run, to have a chance to get elected for Congress. And even our populists, even our country populists have to be, multimillionaires. And I think at some level that does matter, right? Because how on earth are you going to understand the average person that you represent if you've been super rich for a long time? I think it's only natural that you would be a little bit out of touch and that it would warp your worldview, because we're all products of where we come from and what we've kind of acclimated ourselves to.
I don't know, and you kind of touched on this a little bit. I don't know if it's just a false perception of mine, because I haven't really done the research or anything, but it seems to me like really rich people are a lot less shy about seeking public office. It seems to me in another era, the rich people kind of like to be in the background, and they would be patrons to the people who would run for office. Now a lot of them are just straight up running for office.
Yep.
You think about like a Michael Bloomberg, who was held office obviously in New York for a while, ran for president. That didn't work out so well. Not shy though about throwing his enormous wealth around. You could put Doug Burgum in that category, running for president. Not shy about. I think according to his last FAC report, I think 80% of the contributions to his presidential campaign were loans out of his own wallet. So I guess, I look at that stuff. Do you think that's the case where they're less shy about it? And how do we square that with kind of this rising tide of populism where rich people are less shy about running for office? I guess if that's true, but also Richmond, north of Richmond, is a hit out of nowhere country folk song, sort of expressing this rage about rich people telling us what to do all the time.
Yeah, a lot to unpack there. So I think first, and I write about this in the book, I do kind of a history of filthy rich politicians. And there was a time when, like Theodore Roosevelt's parents didn't want him to go into politics because that was seen as something that was beneath him. It's better to own politicians than to be one. You don't want to be one of those people. So some of it, there are trends in our history when it's something that rich people want to do. Think Jack Kennedy. And something rich people don't want to do. Think the time of Theodore Roosevelt. He bucked his family's wishes to run for president. I think part of what's happened is that it takes a lot of money to get elected nowadays. And so it's a lot easier for rich people to self-fund or to tap their network. And I think that you have, to the extent that party bosses still exist, when they try to recruit candidates, the number one criteria they're looking for is someone who is rich, who could self-fund or has a network. So I think that has skewed the types of people who are choosing to run. It's also time consuming to run for office. Even if a middle-class guy could afford to do it, they can't take a year off work to campaign full-time. I think that has contributed to it. And then lastly, I think that we've become a more kind of a society where there's the attention economy. People like attention. People like to be famous. And I think there was a time culturally where rich people would rather be behind the scenes. Now I think we are at a time in a generation where, you get on the yacht and you throw the Benjamins around and you flaunt your wealth a little bit. That's the culture. And I think it is manifested in people who are filthy rich, not just being behind the scenes, but wanting to be front and center. Matt Gaetz is very famous and very rich, and Vivek Ramaswamy he was rich, now he's famous. And I think they want the fame. So I think some of it's attention and buzz.
Matt, at the end of the book, you went through some suggestions on things that we could change. And I've got one of them is to ban the practice of elected officials using their campaign to enrich their family. I've got a bit of a problem with that one, Matt. As a spouse and a political operative of a former legislator, I asked her, I said, if you ever run for governor or Senate, who'd you hire to be your campaign manager? And she said, well, you. And I said, why? And she, because I want somebody who would that I could trust, and somebody who I could be honest with and who would be honest with me, et cetera, et cetera. In the book, you talk about Joe Biden's sister running his Senate campaigns and also Bernie Sanders' wife being a media buyer for his campaigns. But you didn't really make the case that they were paid more than what a person doing that job who they were not related to. As a conservative, do you really think the government should be telling a private entity, which is a campaign, who they can and cannot hire and what they can pay that person?
Good question. And first of all, I will say, I don't know if some of the things that I recommend in the book that I do believe in and I stand behind them, I don't even know if they would pass constitutional muster.
Sure.
Like you could have a court say, no, you can't do that in America. I will say my rationalization for why I am supporting these reforms and in some cases regulations is that I think that running for office and being elected to public office is different than everything else, right? So I think that we have kind of a right to hold our elected officials to higher standards than I might be comfortable with in other aspects of the free market. So that's kind of my rationalization for why, as a conservative, I would support things that maybe I wouldn't want the government meddling as much in private business or something like that. You mentioned the Bidens. This is in the book. In 1988, when Joe Biden ran for president, I think he raised, it's been a while since the book's been out for a few months now, but I think he raised something like $40 million maybe, and 11 million of it went to his family. I forget the details, but a significant percentage. Don't quote me on the details, but it's in the book, but a significant percentage went to his family. I also mentioned Ilhan Omar, who she basically has directed millions of dollars of money through her husband's media consulting firm or political consulting firm as well. And the problem is, on one hand, it's entirely possible that, just like you said, maybe, of course, she trusts her husband. He's a professional. It would make sense to do business with him. The problem is that it's also a way to really launder money into your own personal household, to launder campaign money into your personal finances. And I certainly think whether she's doing that or not, we don't know. It would be very difficult to prove. But I think it creates this appearance of impropriety. I think if somebody wants to work on a campaign, you can't stop them. The question is, should they be paid to do it? In this book, I err on the side of saying we need to go out of our way to have rules that avoid even the appearance of impropriety, because right now the sense that the game is rigged is eroding liberal democracy. So that's where I come down on it.
So, Matt, on the flip side of that, you also earlier said it's hard for a middle-class person to run for office. They have to give up their job. They have to give up their salary and, all those different things. You advocate for candidates to be able to pay themselves a salary. I think they can pay a salary now, but maybe a little bit bigger salary in order to do this. How do you justify those? On one hand, I agree with, I don't think families should get rich off of this thing, but I don't think that the answer is to pay them zero. And, pay the candidate something, don't pay their family anything. Like, how do you balance all those things to allow a middle-class person to run for office when there's somebody who can, doesn't have to work and can just write checks for millions of dollars to their campaign?
Right. There are limits. Right now, you can run for office and you can pay yourself. There are limits as to how much you can make. Some of it are based off of how much you've made in the past.
Sure.
And so I think the reason that's there is so people don't run for office just for the paycheck. Like, we have no idea we're going to win, but I want to make 100.
I think you made that case in the book about a perennial candidate who conceivably could just pay themselves a salary and be running for office constantly.
Definitely. And I think we have to be afraid of, be wary of unintended consequences, that we could try to make reforms that we think are going to solve problems, and you end up creating new problems.
I've actually reported on federal campaigns that seemed like just kind of a host body for certain consultants or direct mail organizations, where they just launched a campaign and they raised a bunch of money, and it was a 90% burn rate. The consultants made a bunch of money, and then they never really went anywhere. And it was like, what was the point of that? And this reminds me of the debate we have all the time about, North Dakota has a part-time legislature, and we really like that. And the argument against a full-time legislature is we don't want to have a permanent political class in the state and all that. And I understand that. But on the other side, who are the sort of people who can afford to take 4 or 5 months off every year and also take time off in the interim? They only meet once every 2 years. In the time off in the interim to attend to service constituents and attend committee hearings and all the other things that we expect the lawmakers to do. It's like, how do you balance this? Where it's like we want middle class people, younger people with families who are still in their careers to be able to seek office, but we also don't want an entrenched political class that sort of an elected nobility, if you will.
Yep.
It's
a real balancing act. Yeah. And to your point, that's one of my reforms. I have a whole bunch of things that take money away from filthy rich politicians, but I would actually pay them more in terms of their salary. Right now, it's $174,000 for the average kind of rank and file House member. I would pay them more because I want them focused on their job. And, if you live in North Dakota, you probably have to be living in Washington, D.C. also, right? If you're trust me, I've done that trip through the Minneapolis airport where you're running to make the connection and to get to Fargo. It ain't easy. So
try to find the connection to Minot.
No kidding.
Why not Minot?
Yeah.
You just fly into the Air Force Base there. No, but yeah, I would actually pay them more money because it's a tough job if you're doing it right, and we don't want only rich people to be able to afford to actually not only run but be a member of Congress.
So, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, Matt, one of the things I was thinking as well is, you mentioned that the sort of wish list of regulations at the end, you don't know if it would pass constitutional muster or not. One of the things I was thinking about, can we get to a place where there is sort of equal opportunity to be an elected official without serious campaign finance, caps, elimination of dark money, all those kind of things? Because as long as rich people, we know that people generally hang out with people like them. So rich people hang out with rich people and they can fund super PACs and that kind of stuff. But can we get to a good place without doing something about how we fund our campaigns?
Well, this is a very interesting question. I gave a book speech to a conservative audience this summer, and somebody in the audience, heard me talking about the reforms I want to do, and he said his question was like, "How are you different from a leftist?" Like and I said, "Well, I'll tell you why. I don't want to do anything radical to campaign finance, right? So I think a lot of people on the left, they basically want public financing of campaigns. They want to just radically overhaul our system. And I understand why they want to do that. And I'm somewhat sympathetic, but I wouldn't support it. And it's not going to happen anytime soon anyway. So it's kind of a waste of time. But I don't support that. I think, so my wife, cards on the table, my wife's a Republican political fundraiser. So I have skin in the game here. I have reason to keep the system going as it is. I think our problem, one of our biggest problems is these unintended consequences right now. I think McCain-Feingold was a noble sounding idea. I think it had a lot of unintended negative ramifications, including really disempowering political parties. And it also led, I think, indirectly to the Citizens United decision. So now we have this scenario where you've got these like super PACs, and it's just, you can't coordinate, but we can put something on the internet. Ron DeSantis puts a memo on the internet and the super PAC sees it, or vice versa.
They can't coordinate, but anybody can go to the FEC and download the list of all the people who donated to the super PAC, right? I mean,
yeah, it's like a whole Rube Goldberg machine. Like it's messy and it's stupid. And what I would do in terms of campaign finance is unlimited donations, immediately 100% transparency. Only individuals can make donations. It's immediately disclosed within 24 hours, posted on the internet. Full disclosure. And so I don't think that would really address specifically the filthy rich politicians problem, but I think it'd be better for democracy than our current messed up, jury-rigged system.
I mean, as Matt, Chad, when you're trying to track down who gave what to what, and so many of the PACs have similar names. It's like, who's behind them? Who is this now? It is a nightmare. I touched on this a little bit, and it does intrigue me. It has intrigued me for a long time what a and I remember I was writing about the rise of populism back when Facebook first launched, and we are heading into, this is going to have, and I'm setting myself up as a soothsayer or something. It's not really the case, but we live in such a populist time. And so one thing that I have always struggled with is we have on one hand this populism where rich people like Doug Burgum are putting on cowboy chaps and stuff and rolling up their sleeves and taking the suit coat off because they want to look like the working man. And not to say that people like Doug haven't worked hard, but you know what I mean? They want to evoke sort of a blue collar aesthetic. And meanwhile, they're filthy, filthy rich. And I don't understand. We're getting more overt about very, very rich people. I mean, we just, Sheldon Adelson's doing this, so-and-so's doing that, and we're moving money over here, and it's so blatant and out in the open, and yet it's also like a hugely populist time. And I mean, Donald Trump's the best exemplar of this, a rich real estate heir, right? I mean, his father made his fortune, and obviously Donald Trump did some, but I mean, super rich New York guy somehow becomes the voice of the unwashed masses of the Rust Belt. How does that happen? There's a disconnect here, and I haven't heard anybody really sufficiently explain that.
Refer you to my chapter titled "Ivy League Populists."
Yeah.
Josh
Hawley,
we talk about
Ted Cruz.
Yeah.
Senator Kennedy, Louisiana.
Yep. I have one about latte. In fairness, I have a latte liberal chapter, kind of about like AOC, Ilhan Omar, people like that, and then I've got a Ivy League populist about Cruz and DeSantis and JD Vance and Josh Hawley and all the names mentioned. So it's kind of an old tradition, because FDR is a classic example of a traitor to his caste, like the super rich New York guy who suddenly becomes Mr. Populist. And it's a weird phenomenon. But it kind of is where we're at today. And I think, I'm okay with, again, I don't have a problem with rich people running, but I think it's a little bit phony, the whole like pretending to be, when Ted Cruz pretending to be like a cowboy, come on.
Matt, shift. Oh, go ahead, Rob.
Well, I was going to ask you. I was going to ask the final question, but Chad, I guess if you've got another question.
Well, I mean,
can I ask Chad? Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Okay. So, my last book, Too Dumb to Fail, I actually read the audiobook, and it was the most brutal thing I've ever done in my life, which is why I didn't do it this time. But I have not heard this audiobook yet. Is it? How did the actor do?
So I will tell you, there are many books that I cannot listen to just because of the voice reading it. And I listened to your whole book. So I think he did very well. I thought the voice was good. There's some that are just like over, I feel like somebody reading a children's book to me. And so that's not very good. So, but that
makes me happy because I am a big consumer of audio information, podcasts, audiobooks, ironically not my own, but thank you for that.
Well, now I'm going to ask you a question. As long as we have you, you're a national pundit. It feels like nothing has changed in this GOP race for the last year.
This is the question I was going to ask. Good job, Chad.
Oh, perfect. So has anything changed in the last year in the GOP race? I mean, other than a few less candidates, but it's all the same again. It feels all the same.
Pretty much. I would say actually a year ago, Ron DeSantis had a lot more perceived juice. So if anything, Donald Trump has gained tremendously from a year ago. I think there was, a year ago, Trump was having like dinner with Kanye West and that Nick Fuentes guy, and Trump had just kind of blown the midterms, and Ron DeSantis had won. So I do think things have changed in the past year. Trump is doing better. DeSantis has faded. And I think the odds are pretty good, 90% likely that you'll have Trump versus Biden. An election nobody in America really wants, but we're most likely to get. I do think that there's a long shot, kind of an outside shot for Nikki Haley. As we're speaking, there's polling that shows that she would beat Biden by double digits. I think she's got a shot to win New Hampshire, which it's a contrarian state. They do weird stuff. Democrats could show up at the primary. So you're saying there's a chance. Yeah, I mean, I think it's an outside chance, but basically speaking, we're in Groundhog Day. Yeah.
Well, that's depressing, and we're going to end the note on that. I was just literally before the show, I was like, I'm going to ask Matt about the presidential race, and then Chad stole my thunder. But I was looking at the polling, and I'm looking at the trend line for Haley in Iowa, and especially New Hampshire, and I think she's coming up. She could do it. But then I look at all the white space between her line and Donald Trump's, and I'm thinking, I don't understand it.
As we've talked about before, it's a competition to see who's down by 35 points.
Yeah.
I mean,
I wish I could understand that. That's why I'm answering the question. I don't understand. We're populist age, but Donald Trump's I don't get it. Anyway, Matt, we'll let you go so you don't have to talk about Donald Trump anymore for probably another 10 minutes.
Nobody knows nothing. That's the, people who are professional national pundits. I think you can glean interesting insight from listening to them, but it's sort of like when you watch the Super Bowl, you'll see Terry Bradshaw and Shannon Sharp and Jimmy Johnson and these players and coaches who are experts, and they'll be like, yeah, I think the Bears are going to win. And you go down the list, and every single one of them will pick the same team, and then they'll be wrong. And the thing is,
that's why we play the games.
That's why we play the games.
Yeah.
You owe me a Coke.
That's how it is. Yeah. All right, Matt. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks,
Thank
Matt.
you.
Hi there, my name is James Wallner. I produce and host the podcast Dakota Spotlight, a true crime podcast that tackles historical and unsolved crimes in the upper Midwest. Follow along with me as we search for a missing girl, attempt to solve a 45-year-old murder, and much, much more. That's Dakota Spotlight Podcast, anywhere you get your podcasts, or at inforum.com/podcasts.
All right, just finished with Matt Lewis. I always like having Matt on. In the world, I mean, I've gotten to know kind of, sort of some political pundits over the years, and a lot of them are so, they're as phony as the politicians are. A lot of them.
Right.
Matt is always the one that I've enjoyed, because I think he's a lot more candid. He's a lot easier to talk to, I think, and it's not all just sort of sound bites and stuff. So I always appreciate Matt's work. I follow him at the Daily Beast. I follow his work generally. He's got a podcast, which I didn't even, Matt Lewis in the News, which is worth listening to. So I like having him on, and when he has a new book out, it's good to have him on to talk about that and to get his insights.
Yeah, and I got to be honest, I kind of like that he does have a North Dakota connection, even though it was 20 years ago that he worked on a campaign out here. That he understands the players, he understands the geography. He knows to say why not Minot when Minot comes up. I mean, I kind of like that stuff.
We like anybody with a North Dakota connection, just like we like playing Rick Helling when it's
Rick Helling 3 for 3 yesterday in our little immaculate group.
All three of us picked Rick Helling yesterday because whenever he fits, I'm picking Rick Helling.
Yeah, I got a kick out of Matt also talking about the presidential race and comparing it to football prognosticating. I just spent a couple nights in Washington where I went out to some dinners and that kind of thing. And I swear every Democrat I talked to is either 110% confident Joe Biden is going to win this election. It's not going to be close, or Joe Biden has no chance. He's got to go right now. It's the amount of confidence in people's opinions in Washington, D.C. and with the political classes is always astonishing to me.
Yeah.
I'm not confident of anything.
I'm not confident of anything. I don't know. The one thing I'm confident in is Donald Trump cannot win re-election. It would be terrible for this country. It would be terrible for the Republic. And the polling, it was actually I believe it was a Marquette University poll that's out this morning that shows Nikki Haley beating Joe Biden by 10 points. If you're Republicans, okay, yeah, you have polling that shows that Donald Trump can beat Joe Biden, but it's close. Nikki Haley is the one that Democrats are going to be scared of. I mean, she's a conservative governor of a southern state. She's a woman. She has an Indian background. She's a woman. I mean, I don't really love identity politics a lot, but it matters.
You just identified a bunch of reasons why she's not going to be the nominee in today's Republican Party.
Well,
right? I mean, didn't she take down the Confederate flags in South Carolina?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the problem is she's not going to be the culture warrior.
Right.
And that's what they want. So,
and she has a really strong, nuanced position on abortion, which after last Tuesday, I think the Republicans need to be looking at talking about abortion differently in this country.
Republicans need to recognize that even a lot of their own base have a nuanced view of abortion. They have got to stop listening to one faction of absolutists. They can't continue to do that. So I think
I was watching some talking heads the other day, and it was who's a guy who wears like the fancy hats, who used to work for Bush, does Showtime's Circus.
I don't know.
Media consult. Well, he was talking to Jim Messina, so it was Republican Democrat, and the Republican said, Messina, you're scared to death. Messina was Obama's campaign manager of Nikki Haley. And Jim Messina said,
well, no. Yeah,
no, they said we are. I mean, of all the
okay,
candidates, Nikki Haley's terrifying to Democrats.
Except that she's not going to be the nominee.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Yes, exactly right.
I mean, I say that. I don't want to be another one of those football coaches on TV saying I know how it's going to be. I mean, you look at her trend line in New Hampshire, it's spiking up. Trump's is coming down. In Iowa, Trump's is coming down. Haley's is on the rise. The problem is can she make up enough ground? Could something, I don't know. I mean, what I'm hoping is she can maybe get second place in Iowa, win in New Hampshire, and then the next vote, South Carolina. And that's her home state. That's what I'm hoping for.
Well, and if she picks up the 2% that Tim Scott left on the field and the 1% that Pence left on the field, I mean, she's only down 32 points.
Shut up.
That was sarcasm, Rob.
Shut up.
That was sarcasm.
All right. Because I was, as you're saying that, I was like, yeah. And then if Doug Burgum drops out, she could get his 0.8%. and then you turned on me and made me feel like a jerk. Just let me have it, all right? I don't want Donald Trump to be the nominee.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem Nikki Haley has is we've only got 2 months here. But I mean, Iowa and New Hampshire do weird things.
Yeah,
so
they do.
Trump did not win Iowa last time. Cruz did.
Well, we'll see what happens. All right, let's talk about, one thing that you and I haven't talked about is the I think the last time you were on, we had the presidential preference polling from the North Dakota poll. Since then, they have released, and Ben and I talked about it some, but since then they've released the rest of the polling. Let me ask you this question, because we talked about this a little bit on the podcast. I wanted to know what you felt. It really seemed like the folks behind the North Dakota poll were really pushing this idea that the legislature is disconnected from voters. And I have a hard time with that because, first of all, some of the things is like the ballot measure proposal they put out there, which I think it's too confusing. You're asking people to vote twice on the same thing. I think the single issue part of that is really interesting, and I think that would have a shot. I think that's a good idea.
So, Rob, you're talking about the constitutional measure to have single issues that has 7 different issues in the question before the voters?
Yeah.
That one?
Coming from a legislature that just got called on the carpet by the state Supreme Court for violating the Constitution single issue. I get it. It's hypocrite. It's still, but isolated, it's a good idea. Whatever its provenance. But I mean, that's not going to pass. And then also, they asked, I think the question they asked was, how do you feel about North Dakota's new abortion law? And, you had a plurality of people saying they don't like it. I think the problem with that is ask them to describe to you what the new abortion law is. I'm not sure they knew what it was. I wish they had actually asked about, but I don't know. I mean, you say, the legislature is disconnected from voters. Most of the incumbents are going to win re-election next year. So I don't know how disconnected they can be. I thought that narrative was a little too cute.
But Rob, don't you think that most North Dakotans, most people in the country, based for their state legislator, easy for me to say, based on national politics more than what actually happens in the Bismarck Capitol?
I think they vote for it based on, I think a lot of it at that level is a team sport, because a lot of, not for everybody. I mean, I think there are voters who are engaged in what's happening at the legislature and have a nuanced view of that. But I think most people, when you get down ballot, it's a team sport. And so they're voting for the team.
Unless they really know the person,
or a recognizable name, maybe is the second most likely. But I think that's, I think that's right.
But I think many of us, Rob, like you and I, think that you and I don't think this, but people who pay attention to the legislature like we do, and the legislators in the state capitol, and maybe the people putting together this poll, think that North Dakotans are like really paying attention to what happens at the state legislature. I mean,
I challenge everybody listening to this at Thanksgiving, start asking all your aunts and uncles and nephews and nieces, what do they like or not like about the last legislative session?
I mean, I kind of have a unique perspective on this because I write about things that are happening at the legislature. And so one thing that I notice is how often I have to write about an issue in order for it to start getting traction in people's minds, right? Like and maybe that's why I think people who are super engaged with politics, like, Rob, why are you so obsessed with this? You don't understand how often I have to like hit the nail on the head to drive it home with the average reader who make up the bulk of my audience, for them to really understand the nuance of this or the complexities and the backstory and everything else. So, I think that is true. Anyway, I don't want to be dogging the North Dakota poll here. I'm so happy to do it. I think it's a great effort.
Especially if there's some consistency and trend lines on how these things
I want to see the same questions, certain questions, approvals and whatnot. I want to see those asked over and over again so we can have data sets where we can track it over time. I think that'll be super valuable. I think the abortion question, I think they would have been better off asking about what the law is and not just saying, the new law. I don't even know that most North Dakota, because really it wasn't even a new law they passed. They tweaked an old law that is suddenly relevant again because of the Supreme Court ruling. So, I think they botched that one a little bit. But the one thing that was really interesting, property taxes. And it's really, really interesting because this poll was conducted November 5th through 7th. 49% of respondents said property taxes should remain a matter of local control. Only 38% said it should be limited. And I hate the sort of punditry that's always like, are you surprised? Am I surprised? Who's surprised by this? But I will say I was surprised. I thought the folks who were pro abolishing property, I thought that would have been a higher number.
So I think that they asked this question in a particularly interesting way. I mean, they asked it in a way, like they framed it how the campaign is going to be framed. It's not, do you want to abolish property taxes or do you not want to abolish property
I think that's how they should have asked it, though, because that's what the debate's going to be. It's going to be local control versus no property taxes.
I'm agreeing with you 100%. I'm saying that the way they ask this question is right on, because it really does frame the way the campaign is going to be run.
Sure.
Local control versus let's get rid of property taxes. I think the last time we were on, we're talking about the presidential, and you said you're surprised. And I said, well, I wasn't surprised. Well, again, I have information that's not public that I'm not surprised. I suspected that the numbers would be somewhat close. This is sort of in the ballpark of where I'd expect it to be. I like the way they phrase this question. I want to see it again in 3 months to see if there's any movement. I think that, Rob, you read the papers like I do. 2-3 months ago, when people got their property statements, they were angry. They're going to city commission meetings, county commission meetings, whatever.
They were emailing me.
We're probably on the backside of that anger. But if this thing gets on the ballot, it's a year from now, where's that anger going to be? So I think this is one of those things where timing really matters. But I like the way they answered the question. As somebody who is adamantly opposed to this Rick Becker concept, I was pleased with the poll numbers. And I think the more people learn about the ramifications of this, the more they're going to be opposed to it.
Now, one thing was really interesting. You actually flagged this podcast for me. And it was Rick Becker appearing on, I think it was Common Sense Uncensored, but they're spelling sense and uncensored like sense is in common sense. If you want to go listen to it, it's kind of an obscure thing.
You're about to give them the Oban bump.
Yeah, that's right. No, if people want to go listen to the full interview, I don't want to deny them that. I don't want them to just have to rely on my characterization of it. But, Rick Becker was on there, and they asked him, where are you at? Where are you at? This is what he said. He goes, and he didn't sound super confident. He said, what I have in hand is far less than what's out there. And then he went on to say, I hate to give a number of only what I have in hand because people will be disheartened, maybe because it's not as much as what we want. And then he goes on to make an estimate. But even there, he is saying that they're not paying petitioners. I have no reason to question that. If they're relying strictly on volunteers, I know I have spoken to a lot of these volunteer-led efforts, and a lot of them get done in by that, where it's like, well, my volunteers tell me they have 1,000 signatures, and then they turn it in and they really have 50. Because people lie. People want to help.
And a chunk of them are duplicates or poorly done or whatever.
Right. So, I think that's part of his problem, is if he's relying on it. But what he's saying that based on what we have in hand, if I were to do an honest estimate, I would say, I'm quoting Becker again, I would say we're maybe not more than a third of the way there. And what I mean by a third is not the 31,000 that we need, but the 45,000 that we'd like. So I did some math on that, just taking it at face value. If they're at a third of 45,000, that's 15,000 signatures. So their measure was approved for circulation on June 26th. It's been, as of the time I did the calculation, it had been 133 days. That means that they're averaging about 112 signatures a day. That puts them well short of what they need if they want to make the June ballot on February. The deadline for that is February 12th. They would have about 10,000, roughly a little less than 10,000 more than what they need by June 29th, which is the deadline for the November ballot. So I don't think they're going to make the June ballot. Again, taking Becker's numbers at face value, if that's accurate, I don't think they have any chance of making the June ballot. The November ballot, one thing that I think they're going to have a tough time with, they've been averaging 112 signatures a day in the warm months. We're about to come into winter. We're about to come into the holidays. Almost all the events are held inside during those months for obvious reasons, because it's cold. The events that are outside, it's going to be hard to find volunteers who are going to want to be out in the cold collecting signatures. Pens freeze up. I mean, that's not easy. And also, when you launch a ballot measure, there's always a lot of people who are really enthusiastic about signing it at first, but everybody can only sign it once. And once you've got all the really enthusiastic people, now you got to find some less enthusiastic people. And so I don't know if they're going to be able to keep that rate up uniform through the winter months into next year. So I don't want to sit here and tell you that this isn't going to make the ballot, but I think it might be a close thing.
Yeah, I would be surprised if it doesn't make the ballot. I mean, they can always reverse course and start paying people. But I think a couple more indications that maybe things aren't going as swimmingly as they would have hoped is one, Becker wrote a letter to the editor where he was, sort of complaining that the opponents to this won't debate him. Well, get it on the ballot, and then I think people would be happy to debate you. But also complaining about groups who have taken a position opposed to this without talking to him first. Well, that's not the way this works. You don't have to go to Rick Becker and talk to him about it before you take a position. Groups have policies on things. But the other thing that I think is sort of telling, there's some indications based on some stories I've heard about signature gathering in Fargo and then here in Bismarck that they're teaming up with the folks who are collecting signatures on the no voting machines, no vote by mail, that sort of right-wing conspiracy around elections, that initiated measure. If I'm involved in the property tax thing, the last thing in the world I want to be is connected with that thing. So I think it's becoming a little more fringy than I thought it would be when it was first announced. And I think they risk putting themselves out on this island where more independent-minded North Dakotans aren't going to listen to their message if they're connected to certain people who are professional signature gatherers, even if they're not getting paid.
Yeah. Well, also, Rick Becker, I don't think is an advantageous spokesperson for this. I think Rick Becker is very popular among a certain faction of North Dakota voters and is deeply unpopular with the rest. He's a very polarizing figure, and I think they're going to have, I mean, if this poll is any indication, they're going to have to persuade people. They're going to have to win some people over. And I don't think Rick Becker is who you deploy to win people over. That's not his thing. The guy's kind of a demagogue. So, I think they're going to have a real problem. Now, Chad, we were going to continue talking about this, but actually I just had some breaking news pop up on my screen. And I think we're going to have another special session because U.S. District Chief Judge Peter Welty just ruled that North Dakota's redistricting plan violated the Voting Rights Act. And he has given them until December 22nd to adopt a plan to remedy the violation. And so that means a special session because the legislature can't adopt a new plan without coming back into session. So that's going to happen. And one thing about that, I didn't really like the redistricting plan, and I have not read the judge's thing. I didn't like the fact that we picked just 2 districts to have sub-districts. I don't know what sort of a fix could be put in place to satisfy what the judge wants. But that's kind of where we're at. But anyway, we're going to have another special session here.
So Rob, part of me is a little surprised, not by the result of this, but the timing. I think generally judges pay attention to what's going on around them. Would have been really nice if this hearing or this decision came out prior to the last special session, so they could have knocked out both of these things at the same time.
Yeah, now the taxpayers are going to go after, and I think a lot of times the tendency is like, this was about voter suppression. I would remind people that the 3 affiliated tribes liked this plan and endorsed this plan. Former State Representative Ruth Buffalo, I remember her standing on the floor, or giving comments to the media, I should say, in support of this plan. The Spirit Lake and Turtle Mountain tribes didn't like it. So even the Native American community was divided on this plan. I do think the legislature was making a good faith effort to try to accomplish something, and ensure that our legislative districts are representative of our population, but apparently didn't meet the court's muster. So here we go.
Yeah, and I'm not going to even attempt to volunteer to suggest I understand the Voting Rights Act and what that means for redistricting. I know we've seen a lot of this in Georgia and other places, but I'm interested to see what Judge Welty said about this and what the remedy will be. I assume it'll be a situation where they'll come in quickly and do a remedy, but
so here's an early question: is do the legislators ask Doug Burgum to call them back into session, or do they use their remaining days? Because the last time when they asked Doug Burgum to do it, he had a price tag for it.
Yeah,
which was
I would like to be in that meeting when they come down the hall and ask Burgum, after they shut down his tax cut idea, to bring him back, what he would say to them. I'm guessing Burgum is not going to be enthusiastic about being the guy who calls him back after they stiff-armed him.
And he may tell them to use their own, because what do they have, 5 days left?
At least 3. It's 3 to 5. I can't.
And a lot of the work on redistricting doesn't have to be gavelled in work. So they have enough days where they could do this without relying on the governor to call them back into session. But that's going to be an interesting
and
dynamic.
You said before Christmas?
Oh, December 22nd. Welty gave the Republican-controlled legislature until December 22nd to adopt a plan to remedy the violation. So by that reading, I'm assuming he wants the legislature to pass a new plan.
The hardest part about redistricting, is it's sort of like a balloon. You push the population into one district, and then it comes from another district. And
especially when you consider how North Dakota's population is. I mean, there's these little population centers that are the bulk of it. And then you have these like wide open spaces that are farmland where just not a lot of people live, but the populations have to be relatively equal among the districts. So how in the world do you do that? I mean, otherwise you have gigantic districts that are the size of Connecticut, or you parcel up the urban areas and combine them with with rural areas. It's not an easy job, but yeah, and I don't think that what North Dakota lawmakers did was voter suppression or anything like that. I think that's going to be the reaction for some people. Maybe that's what happened in other states. In this state, they were listening to some tribal leaders and they were trying to do what they could, but
and I don't know enough about this to offer an opinion of what the redistricting folks were trying to do and not try to do, but I guess we'll see the legislators back in Bismarck again.
I guess we are. All right. Well, that's it. We're going to put a pin in it there. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll talk again. Did you know Forum Communications Company has a robust podcast library? At inforum.com/podcasts, we have everything from politics, sports, true crime, outdoor adventure, and more. Visit inforum.com/podcasts and explore them all today.